My name is Soo Ryon Yoon Soo Ryon. I'm currently based in Hong Kong at Lingnan University in the Department of Cultural Studies as an assistant professor. I most broadly teach at the intersection of performance, Korean culture, and more broadly East Asian culture. But my primary research concerns racial politics and contemporary performance culture, specifically within South Korean context. And so the topic of the talk that I'll be talking about today comes from that focus. I'm trained as a performance studies scholar. I'm not necessarily sure how familiar you are with the discipline of performance studies, but something that I'll kind of bring up in the talk, but it's a discipline that looks at performance. And by performance, I mean very broadly from staged acts to everyday behavior, but performance studies looks at performance as a more kind of primary site of research inquiries. And of course, my research also is at the intersection of dance history as well as Korean studies, obviously, as well as a global comparative race politics where the idea of race and racial politics are theorized within the more kind of globalized perspectives. And so my works kind of align with scholars like Soo Kim. Soo Kim is a theater historian whose most recent book talks about K-pop, actually. So in terms of looking at Korean performance as a more kind of serious subject of study, my work definitely aligns with Soo Kim. So if you haven't looked up her work, I definitely recommend her work. My work also aligns with people like Chang Wook-ho, who's a comparative literary theorist who actually writes about the circulation of African-American literature in colonial Korea. And so definitely sort of in the similar lines of thinking about that racialized relationship. And then, of course, my work also kind of aligns with Korean dance scholars like Judy Van Zyl, who used to be at University of Hawaii, who is really the champion of sort of popularizing or perhaps kind of introducing the studies of Korean dance to the Anglophone scholarship. And so hopefully that kind of gives you some sense of where I'm at. So without further ado, I'll begin my talk. Before I do that, if you actually look at the gallery screen, I don't know what kind of screen you're looking at, but actually I've invited an artist to my talk. His name is Emmanuel Sanu. So you probably see him in the screen in the little black box. So he's one of the central figures that I'll be talking about today. And so he generously took the time to actually connect from Seoul. So I hope we have some time to ask some questions to him if we have a chance later. So thank you. Merci, Emma. So my talk today is titled Making Space for Afro-Asian Methods, Kublai Khan's Burkina Performance in Korea. I draw today's talk from my 10 plus years of research on the culture of African and African diasporic performance in South Korea, which is now turning into a book that I'm working on. In the book, I historicize a wide range of African diasporic dance practices done in South Korean context since the 1920s. Sorry about that. 1920s, and what kind of sociocultural meanings as well as racial politics they engendered. What I will be talking about today is from chapter 3 of that monograph, more specifically, on Burkina performers' work in South Korea, where they collaborate with local artists and activists for new sound and dance experimentations. I've been told that many of you were given reading materials, including the Positions article that I published. So you could say that today's lecture is more of a sequel to those articles that you read for today. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be walking you through the overall context in which the Seoul-based Burkina artist organization called Kulekan and its performers have navigated between the precarious migrant worker status and the position of experimental artists. By examining their works accumulated over time, I propose to think of Afro-Asian methods, which is an analytic as well as an alternative way of knowing and organizing the relationships and politics of engagement between the people of Asian and African descent, particularly focusing on Korean culture. I use ethnographic methods as well as performance studies methodologies to examine several works, and I invite you to think of the broader transnational network in which Burkina performers are conditioned to arrive in Korea and make space in Korea. Some maybe quick clarification before we sort of really start. So by Burkina or Burkinabe, I refer to national origins. Likewise, South Korean, I mean the national origin. There are references to several different ethnic origins because the performers that I talk about, even though they're all Burkina nationals, they also are from very different ethnic groups. So there are Mossi, Siamu, Sanfo, Grunsi, also types of Mandinka or Malinke groups, which I refer to often in the talk. This is a West African ethnic group, but also it refers to a style of dance practiced in the region. So the performers or the group, Kulekan, that I talk about today, introduces the Malinke or Mandinka style dance to Korean audience. Jula is a language spoken in Burkina Faso, and so a lot of the words that the artists use are derived from Jula language. Several sort of locations, perhaps names of the locations that I talk about today includes Pocheon, which is a small city northeast of Gyeonggi province. It's one of the largest province that surrounds the city of Seoul. It is still the base for the US military live fire Rodriguez complex, which is the largest live fire range complex in Korea, as well as a base for an Africa-themed museum. So you already see how the city is sort of very complexly conditioned by its militarized history as well as its cultures. The other cities or the locations that I'll be talking about is Uijeongbu, which is a city near Pocheon. It's a city northeast of, once again, Gyeonggi province. It's also an urban center popular to residents of northern Gyeonggi province and migrant workers alike. And then finally, Hongdae, some of you probably have gone to Seoul in the past. You probably know where Hongdae is, but it's a popular neighborhood in Seoul, also a home to many live venues and clubs. And so the clubs and the studios that I talk about today are, most of them are located in Hongdae. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that information. So here we begin. Sorry, the camera work is shaky because I was also dancing together. A Burkina performer starts tapping lightly on a green glass soju bottle with the chopstick and is soon joined by another who makes similar clacking sounds by hitting his chopstick on a brown plastic beer bottle. The two create layers of rhythms that accumulate in a slowly accelerating pace. In excitement, a dancer bounces his shoulders lightly and slowly up and down. He encourages others to join him in dancing while singers carefully name the individuals involved, gazing at them one by one. The two percussionists on my left add more sonic flash to the rhythms, and other musicians on my right follow with more melodic humming and singing lyrics to answer their fellow performers, generating a call and response performance. In celebration of the modest success of the Burkinabe performers' months-long labor rights struggle in 2014, the sounds fill a small office in the Uijeongbu migrant workers' shelter housed in a church building. The joyful raucousness and vivacity add much needed warmth to the biting winter air. The vignette serves as a springboard for my talk today, in which I will discuss Burkina performers' labor rights dispute as well as their performance works following the incident, which is now remembered as Pochon Africa Museum Incident or Pochon Africa Artist Exploitation Incident. On February 10, 2014, 8 performers from Burkina Faso and 4 Shona sculptors from Zimbabwe held a press conference to expose their almost 2-year-long labor malpractice to draw nationwide concern. The artists had been hired by an Africa-themed museum located in the outskirts of Seoul, in the town called Pochon. One of the performers, Emmanuel Sanu, who is actually here today, who figures centrally in today's talk, spearheaded the movement, performing 6 days a week and undertaking unpaid extraneous work alongside 7 other musicians and dancers also from Burkina Faso. Emmanuel Sanu lodged a complaint against the museum for racial discrimination and labor exploitation. The case was not as straight as one might think, however. The issue was compounded by the fact that there was no proper channel through which artists could demonstrate the unique nature of their work as artists, which prompted them to seek support instead from migrant workers' advocacy organizations that relied much more on the language of material labor and wage work, which may not always apply to the immaterial and flexible nature of performance making. In addition, the Burkinabe artist case was mobilized by Korean politicians as part of their tactics to crush their oppositions by positioning themselves as righteous champions of human rights. The performers' works, however, could not be reduced to a perpetual restaging of their pain in public media, or what is akin to what critical race theorist Saidiya Hartman points out as the spectacular character of Black suffering, or what the literary theorist Jang Ok points out as the shared juncture of subjugation. Instead, the choreographed pieces the performers have created after the incidents address the more complex questions of displacement and racial discrimination, as well as their own inquiries about sense of belonging in their newfound home, that is South Korea. These choreographed works show an aesthetic foundation for what I earlier called Afro-Asian methods. In examining their performance works as case studies that illustrate the workings of Afro-Asian methods, I approached their case from performance studies methodologies, which privilege the body as a site of inquiry. My work is part of a trail of scholarship of performance studies and performance ethnography in particular that invests in performance as a primary field site. American performance scholars like Dwight Conkergood, for example, has been particularly influential in the ways that demand a performance researcher to situate herself as what he calls a co-performative witness, who must engage in the everyday performance of the informants or interlocutors or performers in this case, also as an actor herself. With this in mind, I pay attention to the performers' bodies not just as evidence, but also as a site themselves, as well as myself, who becomes part of that scene that unfolds in local performances. Looking at performance as a site of inquiry allows me to propose a possibility to more complicated politics that work performance labor enacts, which troubles the binary questions about migrant worker versus performer. In so doing, theorizing Afro-Asian methods in the Burkinabe performer's case accounts for the nature of work involved in performance, which harnesses the contradictory process of both subjection of the performers to precarious migrant living conditions, as well as pleasures of embodying and practicing performance. So in other words, it's not enough to simply pick and choose either labor migration or performance, because these are entangled as both sides of the coin. So these performers are not just moving from occupation A to occupation B or factory 1 to factory 2, like many of transnational workers in Korea, but they rather maintain their precarious status as a performer while simultaneously navigating the transnational route of performance circulation. Since the labor dispute with the museum, some members returned to Burkina Faso and others have remained undocumented and have been seeking ways to apply for asylum. One of the efforts done in the process was founding of a performance troupe called Kuleikan, which means a cry of the roots. The founder and its main choreographer, Emmanuel Sanu, or Emma, translated and adapted folk Mandinka culture and contemporary dance movements to address social issues, most often working with South Korean dancers. They've usually performed for dance workshops and festivals, incorporating both traditional Mandinka rhythms, largely influenced by one of their close collaborators, Amidou Diabate's musical training as a griot, and adaptations of traditional julep movements from Emma's own contemporary choreography. They also incorporate interpretations of everyday movements inspired by Burkinabe and Korean cultures. Kuleikan was initially visible in a series of live performance collages incorporating a drum circle and an Afro-contemporary dance that the performers curated called African Sound Party, which was held the last Saturday of each month between February and August of 2014. Africa Sound Party first began to celebrate the resolution of the labor dispute and was curated by the performers themselves with the assistance of the Afro-Brazilian music club called Escola Alegria. Soo Ryon, who's the member of the club Escola Alegria and who has since worked as a producer for Kuleikan, has actively planned and publicized this event with the performers and Escola Alegria's staff themselves. She described African Sound Party as a space to establish community where the local musicians can gather and share food, play instruments, dance, and exchange. Located in the bustling Hongdae area in Seoul, a popular neighborhood known for its clubs, bars, and Korean barbecue restaurants, Escola Alegria attracted local musicians, club-goers, and amateur dancers, as well as American, Brazilian, and French expat communities in Seoul. Like many other live clubs scattered around the Hongdae area, Escola Alegria was more of a small, flexible studio. It was a place for live performances, dance parties, instrument lessons, dance workshops, and food fairs, than a conventional theater venue where seating areas and the stage are divided. At one of those sound parties, after paying my 10,000 Korean won cover charge, I stopped by a small table set up near the entrance for some jjigae jjigae, which is a lamb stew with peanut sauce, and bisap, an alcoholic drink made with hibiscus, all of which were made by Emma himself, who was trained as a line cook. I took a sip of the light rosy concoction that tasted like vinegary sweet potato, the strong citrusy, sweet, earthy, yet pungent liquid filling my mouth and then streaming down my throat. Moments later, I heard the announcement, Kuleikan. On that signal, Amidou and other musicians entered, took a seat in front of a standing crowd, and started to slowly pluck a kora, a lute-like 21-string instrument that they brought from Burkina Faso. The crowd, a mix of Koreans and 외국인, foreigners, conversed with one another in English, French, and Korean. As the music slowly progressed, serving as an introduction to the entire show, people shook their shoulders, playfully gyrating and rocking left and right to the rhythm and the song lyrics. The choreography of the third and most striking segment of the performance that night actively incorporated elements of abstract contemporary dance with a series of slow, pulsing movements that at one point culminated in Emma repeatedly throwing himself to the ground. There was also a hint of folk elements, such as when Emma performed the action of pounding maize or corns in a mortar, which is a gesture towards everyday labor that Burkinab women in the countryside perform after harvesting maize. These segments took an interesting turn, however, when Amidou started playing arirang and the school bell rings, which are very well-known folk songs and very popular children's songs in South Korea. These syncretic performances incorporating Amidou's experiences of teaching daily musical workshops to children at the museum where they're exploited, as well as his own Burkinabe traditional musical training and Emma's choreographic vocabularies, allowed the performers to establish a space in which heterogeneous cultural elements both collaborated and clashed with one another. Songs familiar to South Korean audiences' ears felt oddly foreign, especially in a place filled with Burkinabe music, Brazilian drum rhythms, and an elderly American expat women dancing inside a circle of people. A melange of cultures was shaped by the people's shared feelings based on both the performers and the audience's mutual respect for African diasporic cultures that circulated across the world. Beginning with community events like Africa Sound Party, Kublai Khan transitioned to invest more in stage works. One of the first choreographed pieces Kublai Khan did was a 90-minute choreographed piece for a performance in May 2016 titled Degebe. Through this title, the choreographer asks, "What are you looking for? There is nothing there." There's a sense of amusement conveyed in this question with which Emma diverts the intended audience's consuming, even fetishizing gaze at his cultural background and sufferings to elsewhere. This piece was significant for Emma and the dance company members because it was the first full-length concert dance work that Emma created in Korea for the Korean audience and for the first time since the labor dispute in 2014. At the same time, the layers of the philosophical message in the work carefully unfold themselves to reveal Emma and his dancers' ongoing wrestle with the doubled burden of dispelling certain expectations on their cultural uniqueness and of Emma's efforts to build his fame as a contemporary choreographer. In another more recent work, Degebe 2, Looking Back, released as a 20-minute showcased piece online, features a minimalist duet of Emma and his Korean dance collaborator, Young-il, who you see in the picture here. In a bright lit studio apartment with exposed ceilings and bare white walls, which is turned into a makeshift performance space, Emma and Young-il enter into the camera's view, tiptoeing between potted plants of various heights, soaking up the welcoming sunlight. As each comes together, with Emma featuring more elongated arm movements, often reaching up to the sky, and Young-il highlighting his street dancer background more pronouncedly this time with popping and breaking upper body moves, the two face the camera together and start repeating "Ma danse" in French and "내 춤은요" in Korean, which means "my dance is." If the first iteration of Degebe, the first one that you saw before the slide, was more of a philosophical exploration, The second iteration, looking back, created in the COVID-19 pandemic, no less, appears to be an honest, self-reflective monologue that requires the presence of others. The subtitle is suggestive not of hesitation or dwelling, but of a sense of affirmation of the artist who has arrived at a point where he is looking back on the journey and ordeals he has taken so far, thinking about those of whom he has met along the way. Stripping decidedly legible folk West African elements from the performance renders it more culturally abstract, even though its primary rhythmic structure and melodic sequence are intact. The tricky, if not precarious, balancing act between counter-European universalism and anti-essentialism does not always succeed, nor is it meant to be a completion of an ongoing experimentation. Kublai Khan's collaborations could run the risk of effacing distinctive cultural elements, which are often recognized through the lens of national culture formed in response to colonial and Western-centric cultural dominance. At the same time, however, their performances of the balancing act prompt their viewers and listeners to interrogate their own visual and sonic perceptions trained in nationalist aesthetics and momentarily suspend their anticipation to see performance through the lens of familiar rhythms and dance moves. So in other words, are we applying the question of what is so African about this, what is so Korean about this to this particular case of performance when we don't necessarily ask a similar question when we see a German contemporary dance or American contemporary dance? Kublai Khan's Afro-Asian methods do not necessarily promise to dismantle or challenge existing norms of choreography and music making, but instead continue to pave the way for rethinking the nationalist constraints of performance methods toward gestures of affinity beyond cultural affiliations. The sense of affinity between Burkinab and Korean performers was amplified in the exceptional circumstances of the global pandemic that irrevocably altered the lives of precarious artists. In late 2020, when the fourth wave of the COVID-19 pandemic hit South Korea at an unexpectedly high rate, all artists were forced to cancel live shows and resort to online streaming of documented performances. Emma created a homebound performance for Kublai Khan titled Tari Project, and the Brazilian batucada-infused street performance Yes for the President in 2020 in collaboration with Escola Alegria. In Tari Project, one of which, there are many pieces that were included in Tari Project, and one of which was titled Emma의 집, or the House of Emmas, was made available in December 2020. Emma invited pre-registered visitors to visit a studio space that functioned as a house. So the Kublai Khan company literally built a studio apartment within a dance studio, where he showcased his collaborative projects with other artists. Taking the literal meaning of the Korean word tari, which means bridge, the short-term project was designed to act as a bridge between artists from various backgrounds, as if Emma were throwing a housewarming party for both artists and visitors. The studio also housed an installation of visual works and objects that represented the artists, including a turntable, projected images, and silver party balloons. While the object and installations were mostly works in progress, addressing various personal and professional interests of the participating artists, other objects on display, such as fortune cookies with messages about children of undocumented workers in Korea, or calls for legislation of policies protecting undocumented children, demonstrated a move to a politically conscious and activist-oriented method in Emma and Kublai Khan's future direction. Each performance showcased daily as well as visual objects on display, were streamed and posted on social media platforms for those who are unable to visit the site in person. The arrangements of the documentations of objects and trailer videos of various performances on the Instagram handle become a digitally mediated performance itself, with each post serving as an entry point to Emma and other artists' works that interrogate what it means to build, maintain, and imagine home. For instance, an architect and a designer from the group posted a video about cooking a pasta dish as he reflected on what it meant for him to return home every day after work, while a dancer's video assembled different segments of her mundane movements like raising legs to wake up in the morning or twisting her waist in front of a kitchen sink, as she recalled her memories of home as a protective space that grounded her and her uncontrollable urges to dance. But for Emma, home was a particularly challenging concept, which he, alongside his colleagues from Burkina Faso, had to consistently negotiate with in terms of what it meant to leave home and settle into a new home that always already rendered their presence as an outsider, a foreigner. Ever since Emma began to consider migration as a core part of his professional experiences, home as a theme in his works has come to mean a space that accommodates constant flows of people coming in and going out, rather than settlement. His occupying of a space as home is, therefore, not about claims of ownership. It is rather an open house invitation that recognizes and acknowledges everyone's, including his, momentary participation in making that space. That home space has taken another set of meanings since the global COVID-19 pandemic began to affect South Korea in January 2020. Following the Ministry of Health and Welfare and the Disease Control and Prevention Agency's protocols, performance spaces were allowed to open with limited numbers of attendees. However, most performance artists whose conditions had been always already unstable from labor and immigration precarity found themselves out of jobs and homebound, seeking temporary de-skilled gigs like construction site works and rideshare driving like Uber. While the Ministry of Culture, Sports, and Tourism announced a plan for a 40 billion Korean won stimulus package, which is approximately 35 million US dollars, specifically for supporting employment in the performing arts sector, there has been a relative lack of specific plans that address artists on visas like Emma, whose working and living conditions are subject to pandemic-induced volatility. Amid growing xenophobia and the continued pandemic, 외국인, foreigners, like Burkina performers are, instead of agentive creators, primarily imagined as disenfranchised community members on the receiving end of support for quote-unquote emotional recovery enabled by performing arts' regenerative capacity. Against this pathologizing vision, Tari Project, which also opened with limited capacity following the government mandate, invited artists, visitors, and online viewers to rethink collectively about home under these particular circumstances where home has come to represent precarity and isolation instead of comfort and connection, the qualities of which Tari Project sought to recuperate by building bridges among the participants. In comparison, the performance titled Yes, We're the President, or 우리가 진짜 대통령, was performed explicitly to call viewers' attention to the sudden shifts in everyday urban spaces enabled by the global pandemic. This street performance was not necessarily staged in front of a crowd, but instead documented and made available to public viewers online. Set in the large open-air space in front of the Susek subway station in Seoul, the video of Yes, We're the President begins with Emma and Yongil of Kulekan sweeping the space with large straw fan brooms. The streets are completely empty, and one can only assume from occasional appearances of passersby in surgical masks caught on the camera that the everyday life in the city has been profoundly affected by the pandemic. The general tone of the performance shifts with the quick transition to a display of multiple people joining from separate devices, which reminds the viewers of synchronous meetings on Zoom, a video conferencing software that has become globally ubiquitous by socially distancing ourselves. Each person plays an instrument on the screen: guitar, saxophone, a surdo, which is a Brazilian bass drum, maracas, a rattle, congas, which is a tall and narrow drum, and they form a synchronous ensemble to accompany the dancers. If Dari Project is an invitation into the domestic space, Yes, for the President invites people out onto the streets. Following the first 7 minutes of the slow reggae-like offbeat rhythms where Emma and Youngil's sweeping sounds act as bandeiro, which is a tambourine-like handheld drum, musicians leave their screens to come out of their rooms and join Emma and Youngil on the streets. In a processional form, musicians and dancers march until they stand on an orange grid placed next to where Emma and Youngil were dancing. An aerial view of the grid is reminiscent of the minimum distance of 1 meter, which is 3.2 feet, which is recommended by the Korean Health Authority for social distancing. The performers follow the measures, but also playfully engage with the grid, gesturing the camera to join the troupe. Kublai Khan's digital performance during the pandemic activates an alternative form of affinity, that is, a connection based on a common sociocultural ground that continues to thrive despite precarity and isolation among local and international artists. In part, this is possible because Kublai Khan and Emma and the rest of the performers have already formed a critical distance to what they understand as home and a sense of belonging. The pandemic performance is an extension, not an exception, of their methods of affinity that consistently interrogate a taken-for-granted sense of stability and firmly established cultural affiliations. While their struggles as precarious artists continue beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and their earlier experiences of displacement, their performance continues to open up spaces that invite artists and viewers to rethink acts of dislodging themselves as a more emancipatory move, a move that provides a ground for truly plural and welcoming methods of affinity. So thank you so much. I'll end on that note.